Okay, so let me just go over briefly, do something on the board here to show you. So what we said so far is that we're discussing the subject of Cyrus. This is the Hebrew, Cyrus. Shin, Ayin, Rej, Vav, Sof, which means hair. And this is something which is found in the Nevuah, in the prophecy that Daniel said. Where he says that he saw someone sitting with his hair was white. Obviously, it's a metaphor. So we're talking about what is the spiritual significance of hair? What does it mean? And we said that Cyrus is in one word, this would be tzimtzum. Tzimtzum. And tzimtzum means, I'm mixing the letters. Okay. Let me do it one way or the other. So tzimtzum, tzadik, mem, tzadik, final tzimtzum. Cyrus is tzimtzum, but the reason why we use the metaphor of hair, because it's not an ordinary tzimtzum, it's an extreme tzimtzum. Just like in the body, that the life force and vitality of the neshama is different than different organs of the body. And it gets less and less as it goes from the head or the heart to the hands, to the legs, to the toes, to the heel. But that's a gradual process of regression. Hair, tzimtzum, is an extreme process. Like hair in the human body not only has less vitality than other organs, it's so hidden that it's as if it doesn't exist. To the extent that is the only place in the body, besides nails, which is also similar, is that you can take a knife and cut it and feel absolutely no pain, which means that the life force in the hair is totally hidden. So tzimtzum represents an extreme, Cyrus. Hair represents a place where there's extreme tzimtzum. Okay. Then he says that there's a level up there. Do we have anything better than this? Anyone know? Maybe this? Yep, better. Okay. And we have a level that's called Atika Kadisha. Atika Kadisha, but you don't have to remember it's such a long name because it's also, and most of the time, it's referred to by the acronym, but this is the full word, Atika Kadisha, and it would be just Atik. That's what it's referred to, Atik. Ayin, Tov, Yud, Kov, Atik. And there's hair that's coming from this level, Atik. And then there's another level, which is Malchus. And there's hair coming from Malchus. So he's explaining in the Maimer that when Atik goes through a process of extreme tzimtzum, it'll lead to positive results. When Malchus goes through a process of extreme tzimtzum, it could lead to negative results. So in order to explain this principle, he gives two mashal. The first mashal was a sage who was a brilliant Torah sage, and every word that comes out of his mouth of Torah is very deep and brilliant, but he also will sometimes say something which you don't see any wisdom. The intention is not a class, it's not insight in Torah or anything else. It's some sort of casual comment about something. So the Gemara says that great sages, even their casual statements, have a lot of depth to it, and there's so much you could learn from it. On the other hand, a simple person, not simple, but someone who's not on that level, that his wisdom is so deep. So when he says a casual statement, it's really just literally a casual statement. There's nothing there. So that we're comparing the casual statement to the Cyrus. In other words, when it comes from someone that's filled with a tremendous amount of knowledge, then what overflows, which is that casual statement, also has depth to it. But when it's coming from a place where to begin with, it's not that sort of, there's not that much depth in the source, then whatever comes out, which is sort of casual and an overflow and excess, it doesn't have much to it because it's not the real thing. I think of, it says in Gemara, how did Moshe Rabbeinu become wealthy? Anyone know? What business did he invest in? Which stocks were the best in those days?
From the
Luchos. How did he get wealthy from the Luchos? Right, so the Gemara says that, what are the Luchos? The Luchos, it was given a stone. It wasn't ordinary stone. It was the sapphire stone. You know, sapphire stone, a little rock on a ring is worth thousands of dollars. Imagine two stones that are huge like the Luchos. So that was worth a lot of money, but how did he become rich? Because when you have to make letters, you have to engrave in the stone. And there's, just like with wood, there's saw wood that falls off. Here there was the fallout of the luchas, of the sapphire stone, the little particles that fell as he was carving out the letters. And from these little particles, he became rich. In other words, being that the original source is worth millions and millions of dollars, so when you have the sawdust of that, it's also worth a lot of money. But if you take a nice piece of wood and you would do the sawdust, you can't do much with it. Because original, it's not that the wood is worth something. With the wood, I can do something, but not with the sawdust. Yes, Maya?
I thought it was like a worm or something that ate.
Yeah, there was a worm. It's called Shamir. But what you're thinking of, that is in reference to the Luchas, it's a reference to building the Beis HaMikdash. When they built the Beis HaMikdash, they weren't supposed to use metal. And Shlomo Melech had this worm that, as it would move across the rock, it could split the rock. It's another discussion. So basically, when the source is like Atik, infinite, then even going through a tremendous tzimtzum, there's tremendous depth to it. But when the source is not so revealed, and on top of that, you go through excessive tzimtzum, then it could also be something negative. And we'll give another mushal. Maybe with the second one, we'll understand it a little bit better. So let's go to page 120. So the positive thing in the here is like this, Atik, this level, which is Atik Kadisha. I showed it to you yesterday on the chart that this is really Ora and Sof, is the infinite light of Hashem. Infinite means that it's infinite, and therefore the worlds, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, all the worlds would not be able to nurture from this light. They wouldn't even be able to be created from this light, and definitely not nurture from this light because it's infinite and they're finite. And if it would go through an ordinary tzimtzum, they still wouldn't be able to get it because it's so infinite that an ordinary tzimtzum wouldn't help. So therefore, it has to go through a very extreme tzimtzum, which is described by the word Cyrus here. And only then is it possible for the worlds which are finite to receive this light, which originally is infinite. Yeah.
Wait, what does atik mean?
Literally, the way the literal translation means ancient. Now, I guess ancient means something which goes back very far back in time. So here we're using ancient in a figurative way, meaning it's very high in level. It's interesting that even in halacha, there's a pasuk in the Chumash, the Torah, where it says you should have respect for an older person. So the Gemara says, first of all, it means literally the person's older in age, regardless, should have respect. But it also alludes to a Torah scholar. Why is an older person a Torah scholar? And in Pirkei Avos, I don't know if you remember, but in the beginning, the first Mishnah says that there was a era in history that there were prophets. There was an era in history that there was the men of the great assembly, and there was an era in history that were called the elders. What kind of name is that? Elders. So it's another way of describing somebody who is a tremendous Torah scholar, which means they're very high in level. So we use the term elders, just like a person who's older in time. This is older in wisdom. So now on page 120, he's going to explain it further. So we're starting with the second line. I'm looking at the bottom of the page where it says Ubi Re'inyan. The second line in the second half of the page. This idea can be further explained. The mashal v'nimshal. Wapi masha kosav. We actually spoke about this in the previous mimer, but this is one of the sources for what I told you. Here's where I got it from. Shleima hamelech olav shalom writes in Mishlei, as we know, there's a whole book of Torah that's called Mishlei, Proverbs, which comes from the word mashal. It's a book that talks about analogies and allegories. Lahavin mashal u'melitza. That's how it begins, to understand an analogy and an allegory. Uksiv, and it's written by Darba Shleishes Alaf and Mashal, that Shlomo HaMelech recited 3,000 analogies. Reb Meir, we find something similar with Reb Meir. Omru, our sages say, Reb Meir was the end of a certain era. He was so wise, he was so brilliant, even amongst the sages, that when he passed on, that was an end of an era. And what was his greatness? Where do we see his greatness? When he passed away, Batlu Meshlim Mishalim, there were no more people that were authors of parables. Let's turn the page, 123. And what was so exceptional about Reb Meir, having Amar Talas Meya Mishalim. Reb Meir would recite 3,000 analogies. So 300. Shlomo Melech did 3,000 analogies. Reb Meir was 300 analogies. What does that mean? Because of the depth of their wisdom, they understood the deep, deep secrets of the Torah. It was not possible for their students to understand and comprehend divrei kodsham, their holy words, v'talumis chochma, words that were filled with hidden wisdom. Elam came yemer lehem mashal. So I'm going to say this over again, because now here's where it's really relevant, is that when you understand something and it's very deep and you want to explain it to someone who doesn't have this information, you could do it. You have to find more simple words to explain it. And if you simple words, they'll get it. Not to use abstract language. But then there are times where the concept is so abstract and so deep that no matter how simple and what language you're going to use, there's no way that they could understand what you're saying, because it's so far beyond them. And in that case, explaining it even in logical terms wouldn't be good enough. I explain it with a mashal. That's when we need a mashal. A mashal is usually not an intellectual concept. It's actually a little story, an analogy, a parable. There was a man with a donkey and a monkey, and they came and they went, and he's telling a cute little story which everyone could appreciate. But this story has tremendous wisdom. In fact, every detail of the mashal corresponds to something in the wisdom. And the reason why I need a mashal is because it's so deep that I cannot explain it. I can't transmit this idea, no matter how I say it, in which way I would say, I just can't explain it. And we gave the example the other day, if you remember, just going to remind you, that, for example, if somebody would try to explain to a young child the difference between Chokhmah and Bina in the brain, you probably would not succeed. And if you tell me that you would, so I'll go to the next level of a young child. If you tell me that you can explain it to a 10-year-old, okay, let's try a 9-year-old. Let's try an 8-year-old. There's a certain age where it's just too abstract. They won't get it. They don't understand what you're talking about. Chokhmah is the essence of the concept. Bina are the details of the concept. They can hardly understand what a concept is. How are you going to explain the difference between Chokhmah and Bina? And no matter how much you try to describe it, but if you tell them something about a tree and a seed, and you say, here's a little seed you put into the ground, it grows into a tree, or you give them a mushel of fire and water, and you just talk about the difference between fire and water, how water brings things together, like when you have cement, water brings things together. If you have flour, water brings things together, and fire takes things apart. And that's the difference between Chokhmah and Bina. They're going to go, oh, now I get it. They really don't get it. They get fire and water. They get the mushel, but they don't really get the nimshel. But the reason why I need to do that is because it's so deep. I can't explain it in logical terms. The logic is too deep, too abstract for them to grasp. So Rabbi Meir's level of understanding was so deep and so abstract that he needed a mushel for what he said. That's what the Gemara says. That was the last of the era, that people were so deep that the only way they can communicate what they understood was through a mushel. But his depth was so great that he needed a mushel for the mushel, and he needed 300 mishalim. And Shlomo Melech's greatness was that he needed 3,000 mishalim, which means not that he said 3,000 mishalim during his lifetime, but it means whatever he understood, he would have to explain it to others. He would have to have a mushel for a mushel for a mushel 3,000 times over. And what is the function of a mushel? Let's go to the next line. A mushel hides the deep content of this wisdom by presenting it through something else. The other thing is sort of reflects, it's an analogy, it's similar to it, but it's something which is very foreign. Like fire and water, it's not Chokhmah and Bina, it's something very different. But al pi havanas hadugma, once a student gets to understand the example or the analogy, yitztayer belev hatalmid shemetz mine, this would give the student some idea, or at least of the structure of the concept, in the way that he understands it. Because the Chokhmah is so deep, even the example, even the analogy is too deep for them to understand. Do you remember the analogy that we gave for this analogy? No, I'm getting you all confused. It's not so complicated. I was trying to give you an example. What does it mean you need an analogy for the analogy? So the example that I gave you was, that we can relate to, is that if somebody wants to explain not Chokhmah Bina in the person, Chokhmah Bina in the spheres, and you use the Chokhmah Bina in the human experience as a mushel. So for this student, the 10-year-old or the 9-year-old, that's not good enough. You need a mushel for that. With a mushel, I explain Chokhmah Bina in the brain. Once I understand Chokhmah Bina in the brain, I say, and that's something similar to Chokhmah Bina in the spheres, but it's really a mushel for something much higher. So imagine here's someone that needed 300 or 3,000 levels. Ashelazeh is therefore yitztarach hamushel lemushel. Therefore, you need an example an analogy for the analogy. Ulefierech Chokhmah Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo HaMelech, which was the wisest of all men, he was much more wise than Rabbi Meir. He needed 3,000 mishalim for what he understood. Page 122. He needed 3,000 mishalim sheyerid emig talumas chochmasei beribui eiradas zu achazu. He needed 3,000 levels of having this wisdom lowered and brought down level after level, mushel after mushel. But dugma achrayna, and the last analogy, the final of the 3,000, That was efshar libnei adam lasigam b'moichem utfenasam. That was possible. That was okay for them to understand because it was finally brought down to their level. That was Shlomo Melech. Reb Meir, however, Reb Meir, he wasn't as brilliant and as deep as Shlomo Melech. So for him, 300 analogies was sufficient to explain what he understood. But 300 analogies is so much more than the average wise person that doesn't need 300, doesn't need an analogy altogether, can just explain himself. But Herodas, the mashal is like a coarse, thick garment, and the purpose is to conceal the depth. By concealing the depth, I'm allowing the student to get the skeleton of the real thing, get an idea of the real thing, without really understanding the true depth. And that's not because I'm withholding it from him, and not because I don't like the student. On the contrary, I'm withholding it in order for him to grasp the exterior. And when he grasps the exterior, eventually he'll get to understand the depth. That's how Hashem conceals this deep light in order for us to be able to receive from this level in a way that we will be able to contain it and absorb it. Page 125. It's like hair. The hair that grows from the head of a person is really energy that's connected to the brain, but this is energy that overflows from the brain, so it's not part of my intellectual process, and it gives life to the hair. So you can't compare hair, the energy that's in here, to the energy that's active in my brain. In fact, it says in Gemara that the hair is hollow, and it's like a pipeline that there's a certain small degree of life flow that goes from the brain, and this is what gives life to the hair. V'nikra hamoshel moiser meichen. So this analogy is what we mean when we call excess intellectual energy. She'enoi me'erech. It's not, you can't compare it to atzmis hanimshul shebameiche, to the actual concept itself.
Oh, I'm sorry, I got really lost. The fact that the hair is hollow, that's what the analogy is, because hair is hollow. So
No, hair is hollow is just to bring out the idea that it's that it has the life flow from the brain, the energy that's in the brain flows sort of it flows through the skull, and this is in the hair, which gives life to the hair. So that means that the energy that comes from the brain that's in the hair, it's incomparable to the energy that's in the brain itself. What?
So deep. I like it. How is it different than the energy that's going to every other organ and every other part?
Well, first of all, when there's energy, let's say from the brain, it goes to the hand. There's still wisdom there. For example, of the brain gives a command to the hand to do things a certain way, to write letters, to build something, a certain talent. You see some connection to intellect, at least. I'm using the hand in a logical way. I'm using the hand in a way that I can draw properly, I can write properly, I can use my hand to build something properly. With the hair, there's nothing there at all. And not only that, we said before that the life flow in the hair is so little that it's as if it doesn't exist, to the point that you can cut it with a scissor and you don't feel any pain. So it's energy coming out of the brain, but it goes through such a process of tzimtzum that number one, it's as if it doesn't exist. And second of all, there's definitely no association with intellect at all whatsoever. When the brain gives a message to the ears or to the mouth or to the eyes, there's still something logical going on, intellectual going on. Or even the feet, person who's learning how to dance, a person who's walking in a certain direction, you can say the brain is guiding the feet, where to walk, how to walk. Here you should jump, and here you should skip, and here you should do this, and here you do that. But with the hair, there's absolutely nothing. That's what it means, that it's incomparable to the source. So now he's going to say that, but again, this only is an advantage if these people are really brilliant people. Hine, behold, the Chachamim Gedalim, when you regard the great sages like Shlomo HaMelech and Reb Meir, even their excess intellectual energy, which is the mashal, Hayu Bahem To'elos Rab, is very useful, and it contains great holiness, and it contains in it awesome wisdom. Vadarabba, not only it's also okay, Hayu L'Tzer Godly, it was necessary to do it. Shebeladam, without the mashal, they wouldn't have been able to communicate what they know and what they understand to others. So actually there's a need for the hair. But if you would talk about other sages who were not on their level at all, they didn't say a mashal, they didn't need a mashal. Like the Gemara says, after a mayor passed away, there were no longer people that were in this caliber. What does it mean? Because their wisdom to begin with is not so deep. And people could understand what they're saying without a mashal and without all the analogies. They can just hear the concept itself. So therefore, ein tzrichen mashal, they don't need the mashal. If they start giving mashalim for something that you can understand without a mashal, then it will be just empty words. There's no need for it. A little bit later, he gives an example of a lavush, a garment. That just like a garment has to fit the person, and if it's too small, it doesn't fit me. If it's too big, it's also not good, because then you will fall all over it. If it's not necessary to be so long, and it's very long, you'll trip on it and fall. So if you don't need the mashal, if you don't need the garment to hide the wisdom, then by giving that garment, you're confusing the student, not helping him. So the same principle will also apply to the spheres. So we have two examples that he gave from the Gashmizik world. One is the example of the sage who gives a mashal, and the mashal is positive. And there could be another wise person that uses a mashal, and the mashal will actually be negative. And the other example is of a sage that when he says something casual, there's depth and wisdom to it, or someone who says something casual and there's no depth to it, there's nothing there, it's just empty words, it's casual. So the same thing is Lamaila. Hamshoches achayes matika kadisha. When there's life flow that comes from this level which is infinite, Ein Sof, Atika Kadisha. And that is something which is efshel iskabel ba'ilimus. This light is infinite, and therefore it can't be received in the worlds. Gam batzilus, even the world of Atzilus, because remember we said yesterday, even the world of Atzilus is also finite. And if it would receive a light that's infinite, it would just no longer be able to continue to exist as it is, a finite world. So therefore, it needs this process, that it shouldn't become nullified. How is that? This is they levushim, through the garments that conceal the light. It's like being in a room where there's a brilliant light. It's so brilliant that it's blinding, and you hang up a curtain in the middle. This is the garment. And by hanging up the curtain in the middle, the other side of the room is lit up, but it's nowhere as bright as it was before, and it's not blinding anymore. Now I can stand with my eyes open, and I'm able to handle it. So the cyrus, the hair, is sort of the process of tzimtzum that this infinite light of Atika needs in order for that light to be delivered to the rest of the worlds. Then he brings two references from somewhere in Kabbalah. We're going to skip that. Masha'en kain, unlike Then there's the light of Hashem that's not in Atika Kadisha, but the light of Hashem that's in Nukva, which is Malchus, the sphere of Malchus. Azai ha'ora hanimshecha. So in other words, let's look at the map. Atika Kadisha is Oren Sub, is infinite. That's even higher than Chachma. That's a different realm completely. Malchus is one of the 10 spheres, where we said that there's a process of regression. Every sphere, the light of Hashem gets less and less. And Malchus is the 10th, which means the light of Hashem is hidden there more than anything else. So, Azai ha'ora nemshechas mimena b'bchinas neivus and meiser meichen. If there's light that comes from there in such a way which is excess intellectual energy, which means it'll go through a process of symptom like here. You can't compare this to the process that when it comes from Atika Kadisha. Because here you're taking something which is already diminished, the light, and now it's going through an extreme process of tzimtzum. And a light that's diminished, that goes through an extreme process of tzimtzum, becomes too hidden. It's so hidden, this can ultimately lead to the nurturing of external forces. So maybe it's just easy to look at let's look a moment at the chart that we're looking at. The chart, which was on page, 53? No, 57. So when you look at the worlds in each world, but now we'll focus on the first world, Atzilus. The light of Atzilus and Chochmah is lower than Or Ein Sof, obviously. But then with each sphere, the light gets less, less, and less. Finally, in Malchus, the light is more hidden. And the reason why it's hidden is, there's a purpose for that. Because this is supposed to enable the next world to be created. If the light of the previous world will also be shining in its full brightness, then all you'll get is Atzilus. There won't be any room for something like the world of Bria to be created. So therefore, the light of Atzilus has to be hidden, and that's why it gets less and less and less until it comes to Malchus. And Malchus creates the new world, which is Bria. And the same happens in Bria. The light gets less, less, and less, and less, and less, until it comes to Malchus of Bria. And Malchus of Bria creates the next world, which is Yitzirah. If there wouldn't be the light being diminished and less in Malchus, then the world of Yitzirah could never have been created. But being that the light in Malchus is so hidden already, the normal process of Tzimtzum, if you're going to add to that now an extreme Tzimtzum, it's going to be so hidden, and this will allow the external forces to get light. What does that mean? What it means is that we know that Hashem created Kedusha and he created Klippa. So where does Klippa get its life force from? How do they survive? Klippa is the opposite of Kedusha, it's the opposite of godliness. They're not vessels for godliness. So how could they exist? And the answer is, in order for them to have life, Hashem takes the light and conceals it and conceals it and conceals it in a very strong way. And then Klippa can exist as a result of the light being hidden. You can almost compare it to, or maybe it's the same idea, even in the physical sense, that when there's no light, that allows the possibility for different things to be that are damaging, that allows someone to fall, to get hurt, not to notice where there's a hole in the ground or where there's a rock that it can stumble over. When the darkness allows certain animals or creatures to come out because they're under the cover of darkness. The darkness allows criminals to come out because now it's dark, so they feel they can come around. So in a sense, the darkness is what allows Klippa, because when light of Hashem is revealed, they can't handle that. So the light of Hashem has to be concealed. So if the concealment is much more than it should be, then this will enable Klippas to have more nurture. And that's what it means, that if the light is going through extreme tzimtzum in a place where it's not supposed to, then this will give klipa more life than they should be getting. Yeah.
That's why married women cover their hair.
That's connected to why married women cover their hair.
Because it's what you said, light's going through symptom where it's not supposed to be.
Right. In other words, a woman, we'll learn later, is connected to the sphere of Malchus. And therefore, she's connected to this place where the light of Hashem is already go through a process of tzimtzum, it's hidden. And now the hair, which is the excessive tzimtzum, if it's not protected and if it's not guarded the proper way, then it could lead. In other words, when we say that if a woman's hair is uncovered, it's not tznius, it could be attracting a man, and it could lead to a certain problem. That's in a very gashmistic level. But the source of this in a spiritual place is that the hair up there becomes uncovered. And if the hair up there is uncovered, in the realm of Malchus, that could lead to forces that are not supposed to be getting this chayas to get the chayas from there.
Somebody said like the klipa attaches to the hair or something. I'm not really sure what that means.
So what I'm explaining,
That's what you're.
it's not something here. Here, Here, when we say that there's an issue with tznius, then you're talking about how it could affect relationship men and women. But we're saying, no, what's happening down here is a result of something going on up there. Up there are forces which Hashem created, which are called klipa. They get a certain limited amount of energy because Hashem wants them to exist, so there should be free choice. But we don't want them to get more than their share, more than they need. They're there for a certain reason, but we don't want to give them more strength than they're meant to have. When the light of Hashem becomes very hidden, like generally speaking, if you remember, even in Tanya it says, when we do Averis, we're giving chayas to klipa, we give them sustenance. Why? Because when I do an Avera, I'm hiding Hashem's light more than the norm. And when Hashem's light is hidden more than the norm, that's when they could nurture from Hashem's light. When it's open, they can't, because the light of Hashem will blind them. And when it's hidden, they can absorb and take that light of Hashem because it's hidden. Now, all of us need the light of Hashem hidden. So the answer is, but for us I mean to say, Kedusha or anything which is not Klipa, an ordinary level of tzimtzum is sufficient. For the Klippas, it has to be much more hidden in order for them to be able to receive it. Yeah.
I thought like Klipa wanted to attach when there was lots of blessings or lots of brachos. Not just the Veiros, because that's why you cover your hair, because there's like a potential for a lot of blessings.
Right, so it's along the same lines. Because this is a source of bracha, it's a source of life, it's a source of sustenance. Therefore, they're running to go there to get that chayes.
Why does covering with something physical make a difference?
Because when I cover it physically here, Here, it gets covered up there, There. When I cover it, in other words, whatever we do down here, there's a counterpart out there that the same thing happens. Just like with me covering, I'm blocking it from people outside of myself. So up there, it also gets blocked from things outside of Kedusha. That's where it's really happening.
So when a person gets married, a woman gets married, then they're inherent, it's extra Kedusha, and that's because Malchus is like.
So this is one thing which I try to do some research on it. Like, if that's the case, why is there a difference between a married woman and a single woman? If every woman comes from Malchus. I can make up my own theories, but I don't want to do that. I'm looking for a source that should explain that this principle applies only to a married woman, because for a single woman, it's not even, and somebody might say, well, is there any point in being more machmer as a single woman to cut my hair? The answer is no. There's no point. There's absolutely no problem whatsoever. So obviously, whatever we're talking about, for some reason or other, only applies to a married woman and not to a single woman.
But you can't find a source.
I've been searching and I haven't found it yet.
It's kind of like,
But
So every Jew does this, but there's no source.
no, there is a source.
For covering your hair.
No, No, covering hair for sure. This source.
Oh,
I'm talking about the source in Chassidus that would explain why this Chassidic concept only applies to a married woman, not to a single woman. Yeah.
So women who aren't well versed in Hasidus, they just cover their hair because they're told to cover their hair.
No, they'll cover their hair, first of all, because the Torah says so, whether I do understand or not. And we'll also explain it based on a Gashmistic reason. That just like parts of my body should be covered because that's tznius. So the Torah considers hair something more intimate, and therefore it should be covered. Even when you talk about covering the body, people can start arguing, this should be covered. That doesn't matter if it's not covered. So there are different opinions. The Torah has its opinion. What the Torah considers is considered something more intimate, and therefore it should be covered. So I guess the hair is maybe somewhere borderline in that area, and therefore some people think it doesn't matter. I remember once speaking to a couple. I'm just giving you an example about the wife was getting involved in Judaism. The husband wasn't too excited about it, and she's doing one thing, another thing. Well, what she does for herself is one thing. Then you do things that affect the husband, it gets a little bit different if he's not on board. So she wanted to cover her hair, and he was against it. And he said to me, the main thing that attracted me to her was her hair. And I think every girl and every woman would agree that the hair is something very important to them. So the Torah says that hair is something intimate, and therefore it should be covered, and it should be something just between you and your husband, and not for a stranger. That's the Gashmistic reason. When you understand Al Pi Chassidus, usually everything in Torah could be understood on a certain level without Chassidus. Chassidus helps to understand much more the details, which sometimes the general idea is understood, but the details I can't figure out. When you study Chassidus, a lot of the details start fitting into the picture much more. Yeah.
But then also some Chabad women, I know some, not all, but who get like buzz cuts under their shadels, and it's not even sharing it between them and their husbands, like not sharing it at all.
So got to speak to them and see what they're thinking.
But it's also really hard to have like your same hair when you have a lot of hair underneath the sheitel, and then if you get rid of it, then like you're getting rid of part of that attraction between you and your husband, because it's a nuisance to have it wet under a sheitel and all these issues.
Okay, so at this point, we'll give it over to the Jewish home class and let the Rebbitzins take care. Yeah, out of my league. Because the last time I wore a sheitel was a long time ago.
It was warm, I guess.
Yeah, even that a long time ago.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you.